Welcome back to Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw, the interim chair at the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and also school psychologist. And so that's part of my training. And what we're going to talk about today is implementation science. And implementation science is the study of methods used to promote the adoption and integration of evidence-based practices and interventions into routine healthcare. This comes heavily from public health, is its primary origin. And now we're seeing it applied more of the methods applied to psychology and education, both from a bigger picture issue in education, but also on very specific issues. In other words, how to implement a new idea for therapy for an individual is the kind of narrow version of implementation science. But implementation science comes out of, at least the Canadian version, where we're seeing it used on a large scale, comes from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Our version of NIH, although this one actually works now, just throwing shade at my American friends. But this comes from CIHR developed really knowledge translation that needs to be baked into all research. In other words, no matter what research you're doing, there needs to be some plan to translate the knowledge out to a wider audience so it doesn't just collect dust. And this was really helpful. So anytime you write a grant for CIHR, and now it's the other organizations too, NSERC, which is more of the science engineering type of component, or SSHRC, which is social sciences and humanities, those three organizations all really like to see knowledge translation. Knowledge translation involves synthesis of information that's available on a certain topic, how you disseminate it. In other words, any grant you write for Canadian federal research really has to have a plan on how you're going to get the information out. Publishing in journals is fine, but how else will you get it out? What kind of exchange is there between the researchers and knowledge users, or the end users of research, or decision makers, or policy makers, or whomever? And then there needs to be an iterative process by which that research is put into practice, or the application. So that comes from all of the grant writing. And of course, as you know, when you control money, you control a lot of the dialogue. And these major research foundations do that. And so this makes kind of Canadian research especially amenable to implementation science, which is slightly different. Implementation science is more like the final stage of knowledge translation, going from knowledge to practice. We often look at it as there's this black box, which is the nice way to say it, a black box of we have this knowledge, this research, and how are we going to use it? Well, how it gets from one point to another is kind of a mystery. And that's what implementation science tends to systematically go after. It involves an exploration where there's a need identified to have some sort of change. And then an installation, preparing a staff to receive a new change of ideas. And this is hard. I say this all the time, that everybody wants change, nobody wants to change. And this even includes an idea that's better, more effective, more efficient. People still don't want to change. And so there's a lot of friction there that needs to be overcome. And this installation of a new idea is not that easy. You don't just say, do this, it's better than what you have, and it automatically gets done. You need to prepare people to learn and change. We all see this. It's very hard to change ideas once they're in place. I can say that because I've had to do this twice in my career. I was actually trained as a psychologist using Rorschach. And then the more I learned, the more I thought, holy moly, this is just silly. It was just really hard because I really invested a lot of time and energy into it. And so I changed off of that. And the other one I had to change was using neuropsychological assessments for routine academic or behavioral problems. Learning that is absolutely a waste of time and energy, which is hard because I invested years into learning those skills. So, we all have to do that, but I have to say, it's extraordinarily difficult to do that. You feel like you have kind of a sunk cost fallacy and you don't want to stop. So does everybody else. So when you say, I have this brilliant new idea, I want you to apply it, it's better, faster, cheaper, more efficient, it's still difficult. So a lot of implementation science is getting people ready to adopt new ideas, helping folks to monitor and evaluate how things are done. Because we have concepts known as treatment fidelity or treatment integrity, which is when we find something's effective, can we implement it with the same skills, with the same accuracy of the original study? The closer you are to the original study, the more likely you are to see the positive effects from the original study. So this requires a lot of energy to not only get people ready to learn, but to implement programs well. And then there has to be the sustainability effect. It's not just will people do it, will they keep doing it even after you monitor them? Is it something that's going to change and be sticky? Because right now it's kind of like the South Park underpants gnomes. The gnomes steal your underpants, and they say, well, why are you stealing our underpants? And they say, which I just like saying underpants, which I find a funny word. But they say, well, what we do is we decide we're going to steal the underpants, and then we're going to make a lot of money. Well, what's the middle? How do you get from point A to point B? And the arrogance of many researchers is really saying, we had this brilliant idea, and therefore people are just going to do it because it's so brilliant. Well, they're just like the underpants gnomes. How do you get from point A to point B? Because clearly it doesn't happen automatically. And it's also difficult because we not only have implementation science, we also have de-implementation. How do we stop doing something that's ineffective? And ineffective practices that have been put in place for a long time are notoriously sticky. I wrote a whole paper about that, including the old story of Ignaz Semmelweis, who was the person who said, hey guys, maybe you don't want to go directly from doing autopsies directly to delivering babies because you transmit infections that kills babies. How about washing your hands first? And of course, he was ridiculed terribly because this is something that had always been done. And of course, my personal favorite excuse that Semmelweis heard was, gentlemen don't transmit germs, and which I find amusing and funny and horrifying. And this was his logic. And so there's so much stickiness to ideas, even when the problems put you right, smack you right in the face that there's giant problems. In Semmelweis's case, the issue was that physicians delivering babies had a much higher baby death rate than did home deliveries or deliveries with midwives. They had much more success. Well, it was because the physicians just got through doing autopsies and didn't wash their hands. Well, this sounds stupid and obvious and simple. It wouldn't have taken very much time or energy or money to make a change, but people will not make change. The idea of implementation science is so exciting because it's helping us to break down and understand how we get people ready to accept something new. This is not easy. This is a big systemic issue, and it's a big personal issue. It's hard to de-implement something you're doing in exchange for something else. Just to give you a story about that, one of my very first bits of advocacy was my master's thesis showed that there was significant race and gender bias in corporal punishment using kind of psychometric techniques to determine bias. And it was quite obvious when you look at the numbers, it wasn't even close. Yeah, that's an issue. So when you bring that to teachers and say, well, maybe we shouldn't hit children because it's fundamentally unfair. It's probably unconstitutional, and this was in the U.S. And the response I got back, well, if we don't smack children, then what are we going to do? Not understanding that the concept was just stop that, and it'll be good. But they wanted an alternative. And honestly, if we gave them an alternative, which there are many have been in place for dozens, if not 50 years of better alternatives than that. Of course, doing nothing's better, but we gave them these options and people still wouldn't accept it. So the stickiness is there. The idea that implementation science can help us to break down some of these issues of why things are sticky to de-implement, how we can smooth the friction, reduce friction so that new ideas can be put in place and create a culture where new ideas are accepted and appropriate, and have new ideas that have the credibility and relevance, hence the whole series that we're doing here. This is a bit important idea. And I'm pretty excited about implementation science. When it first came out, to be honest, it wasn't really science. There were some descriptions, there were some ideas, there was kind of some public health work, but not really helpful. There's a lot of inductive sort of approaches. There weren't really theories that were any good. There were some heuristics, some frameworks, and those were fine. But now we're starting to see real models and real theories of implementation that are very exciting. And they're growing. It's an extremely dynamic field. So we went from something that sounded great. We knew there was a problem. We knew the underpants gnomes. We had to figure out what got them from underpants to making lots of money. Same thing. How do we get from knowledge to making it in practice? Because it used to be the only way to do that was to influence policymakers who would create law or policy about how you do certain practices, or even like boards of examiners in psychology who had to make a case for to make a case for restricting the form of practice in place, or professional associations. That's how things got done. We forced practitioners to make the change because we changed law, regulation, or professional practice guidelines. And that's how it was done. You kind of force people to do it. Well, when you force people to do it, after a while, it just becomes habit. But remember, people don't like to change. It was, I think it's the Niels Bohr quote of, science advances one funeral at a time. Nobody's mind gets changed. It's just that you teach and train the new generation so that when they take over, that they are used to this new idea. The older people just retire or leave practice, and then that's how you de-implement. That's sort of discouraging, but I think that's really kind of how things go. And of course, in psychology, one of the hard parts we have is the biggest impediments to making any changes in implementation are quite often internship and field placement supervisors. The university can teach people new, innovative ideas based on research, and then they go out to an internship facing somebody who doesn't want to change. And they kind of indoctrinate the new interns, the new student who we're training with new ideas, and they kind of indoctrinate them in old school approaches because they're very difficult to change. So psychology has that extra bit of friction that needs to take place. But right now, what I'm excited about is we're seeing a lot of things happen that are really, really positive and really good in the field of implementation science. The biggest one is we're developing models. The biggest ones are we're developing theories of implementation that are very exciting. They're kind of based a little bit more on knowledge translation and a little bit specific. But we're seeing a lot of good things happen that way. And in terms of making basic research relevant, we're starting to borrow a lot from public health, which has its own problems. But one of the things that my lab started doing is we've just started to work on more hybrid designs. That's where we measure the effectiveness of an intervention and implementation factors at the exact same time. So we don't have knowledge and we put it in practice at some point and figure out the black box later. We actually do knowledge development, and we develop some of the components of how you get this in practice at the exact same time we're doing it. So those designs are not that difficult to do, but as you know, getting people to change to do this is hard. But right now, implementation science has potential, but it's still a black box of how we get from knowledge to practice, and assuming it's going to happen is just like the underpants gnomes. It's just not going to happen without full effort. So I'm excited about this idea of research as its own factor. I'm excited about the direction it's going, but this is one of the ways we can make research going from collecting dust, even if it's clinical research, even if it's important research on things like suicide and drug addiction and key factors involving long-term mental health, doesn't matter. They're still collecting dust. Now let's get them into practice as quick as possible. And now we're very excited to have a field of study that supports this. So I'm very excited about this, but there's a long way to go. So let's make research relevant, and I will see you next time on this same channel. Thank you.